strategy. Thanks so much for being willing to serve as a work group member here. There is going to be a few slides where there's some kind of orientation to WebEx. If you are a Zoom user, sorry, we have WebEx, but we have a few kind of orienting slides, and then we'll jump in. My name is Ruchi Sudhir. I'm Associate Director for Strategic Engagement at the Oregon Department of Energy. I'm joined by a lot of people, but I want to just shout out a few who we're going to hear from most today. Jeremy Hargraves, he's from Evolved Energy Research. You might remember him from the first working group going through a lot of the modeling work. And then Michael Friel, Senior Policy Analyst. He is going to be the primary lead from the ODO team. And we have a few other ODO staff on the line for support, including Amy Schlusser and Todd Cornett, in case some specific subject matter questions come up, as well as a few others that you'll hear from in a minute. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that helps you kind of orient to WebEx. If you have an issue, let us know in the chat. My colleague Abby can assist you with any technical issues. The way we have this set up is that all working group members are panelists, and so you should be able to mute and unmute yourself and turn your camera on and off as needed. If you'd like to change your name, add your pronouns or your affiliation, you can hover over your video, click those three dots, and you can edit the display name. If you'd like to participate in the discussion, raise your hand. I'm going to be helping to moderate when there's a good pause to call on people, or if you want to put your questions as you're thinking of them in the chat, we can kind of bulk them and answer them as we go. To raise your hand, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see a little speech bubble. That's the chat window, and then there's a little hand icon at the bottom of your screen that would help you raise your hand. And then if you are on the phone, if you're like kind of listening in with the phone line, you would do *3. And then members of the public that are joining as attendees to listen in, you'll be able to use the chat, and we also want to have a time for public comment if we're able to get through the slides, or we can take raised hands too. But if we run out of time this time, we have a second meeting of this working group, and so we'll try to make sure that we have enough time there. And then again, if you have any technical questions, anyone, please contact Abby. I also wanted to mention that there's a public comment portal, just generally, about all topics for the Oregon Energy Strategy. So that's also another tool. Okay, next slide. So this describes our working group's purpose. It's really an opportunity to inform the development of the energy strategy. And we brought this group together because we want to listen to your thoughts, your questions, help us to sort of point in the right direction for various assumptions related to land use and natural resources as we think about going forward to 2050. And then we have a real task in terms of all the what if questions, like what if this source, what if this data, what if this piece of land. There's so many what if questions that can help us to understand different potential clean energy pathways. And so we're really looking forward to that part of the discussion too. If you're able to turn your camera on, we would appreciate it. It kind of helps with the engagement and kind of the back and forth among the working group members. And then we have a couple of sort of community agreements or ground rules, however you want to call them. We're hoping that we can all sort of listen carefully, seek to learn and understand each other's perspective. We want to encourage respectful, candid, and constructive conversation. We're hoping that you can keep an open mind and ask questions to clarify and understand the why behind what people are saying. To be open, transparent, inclusive, and accountable, respect different opinions, and to be conscious of some speaking time. So if there's an opportunity to step back and allow space for others to contribute, we would welcome that. Next slide, please. This is our brief agenda. We're a little over already, sorry for welcome and introductions. And then we're going to spend some time with Michael to set the stage. We're going to pass it to Jeremy to have kind of a discussion and sharing of how electricity generating technologies and I think that's a typo, that might need to say land use as well, are considered in the reference scenario. And then we'll be talking about alternative scenarios and those what if questions. Next slide, please. Here's the working group roster. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet everyone, I'd love to use this time for you to practice using the chat. If you could just introduce yourself with your name, your organization. And then one thing, this is kind of like an icebreaker question, so sorry if it's corny, but one thing that you are doing fun this summer that's not this working group, because you know this working group is going to be pretty fun. So, I mean, you have to pick something else that you're doing fun this summer to give us a sense of what you're up to, as well as the geographic location that you represent. So I'll give you a little awkward silence here to fill that in the chat. All right, thank you for adding to the chat. If you're not done with your introduction, you can keep doing that. I'm going to actually go back one slide and pass it to Jeremy to introduce the Clean Energy Transition Institute team.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research and part of the team that is doing the energy strategy here. The rest of the team members are on the slide, so it is a project being led by the Clean Energy Transition Institute, Eileen and Ruby's on the call today. And then others on the technical modeling team include Elaine Hart, Angela Long, both of them are on the call. And others from Evolved as well are supporting the work.
All right, over to you, Michael.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruchi. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see a lot of faces. I've been emailing many of you, and it's fun to finally get everybody together. I appreciate you making the time to speak with us today. So we did have the first working group meeting last week, which went really well, and we're excited how many people attended it. And we also have the recording online. But hopefully, most of you took advantage of that, either attending the meeting or watching the recording. But we did want to make some space to kind of do a recap of the highlights and kind of check in and make sure and see if there are any foundational questions while we have Jeremy here. So we have Jeremy, our energy modeler, at this meeting. He won't be at the next meeting. But so this is a great opportunity to kind of ask him any of those energy modeling questions or clarifying questions from that working group. And we want to make time to do that now before we go into the reference scenario and talk more about what we're going to do today. And so I sent around a 2-pager, kind of a summary of what I thought were kind of the highlights of the energy model, email it this morning. So that's a good reference point. A couple of things I do want to highlight from that in just thinking about the model at a high level. Thinking about it in 2 phases. On one phase, what we're doing is we're calculating Oregon's energy demand for the residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation sectors and figuring out the end use, what that demand is. And then on the supply side, we're thinking about the energy resources that could supply all that demand going into the future from electricity, direct use fuels, and transportation fuel sector. And so this model isn't necessarily, it's a forecast, but it's not necessarily predicting the future so much as it is figuring out which energy resources could meet that demand and how the relationship to each other with least cost within the parameters of our existing policy within the state of Oregon. So for example, we don't allow nuclear facilities, so it wouldn't necessarily sit like that as an option for Oregon. So we're kind of working the parameters of our existing policy. And the end goal is our emissions target from Executive Order 2004. So our 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050 is our goal for our reference scenario. And it's also important to note that the model will not, especially this is really important for land use, not necessarily pick exact locations of resources or transmission. We're looking at statewide and generally speaking, so we're not going to say there's going to be this facility in this exact location, so much as we're looking at the broader scope of the geography of Oregon. And there's levers within that things we can look at as far as what resources might be available and how much could be available for like rooftop solar, how will electricity storage have land use impacts, different energy resources beyond solar, whether we would want to limit the availability of like utility scale solar options. All those things are different levers that would impact the modeling. And it's important to kind of consider that in terms of what if scenarios, in terms of what could happen, what would we want to change, and how would that compare to our reference scenario. And so that's a lot of different information. So I do want to pause here and I'll stop sharing so we can look at each other and see if anybody has any clarifying questions from that first working group or questions for Jeremy.
I see Anne's hand up and then and then Andrew. So maybe we'll go to Anne. Want to unmute?
Yes. Hello, good morning, everyone. I had a clarifying question based on reviewing your notes. You know, you're talking about identifying the low cost option. And I'm just wondering if you could just say a little bit more about are costs just dollars and cents, or how are you dealing with externalities? Because of course that's going to be a key question that this group works with. And so if you're going to get to it later, that'd be great. But that's something I've been wondering about. Thank you.
It's a great question around sort of something we've been talking to Clean Energy Transition Institute staff about as well, in terms of how to think about co-benefits and where that fits into the model. So that might come up in the later part of the conversation, but I'll let Jeremy respond briefly to see if he has some initial thoughts to answer.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, because I think that when we say least cost, then it often it goes towards that conclusion that that's the only thing that we are caring about. But cost is just one objective among many that state could be pursuing, particularly as you mentioned, there are a variety of externalities that are either difficult to cost or cost is not the appropriate kind of measure for that. And so the way that we deal with that is we're using least cost optimization as an organizing principle for what kind of investment we should make within each scenario. But then the scenarios themselves are constrained by a variety of other considerations. So where we can build resources, when we can build resources, the other types of policy drivers or policy priorities in the state. For example, when we're setting up scenarios, and this gets into the what if questions, scenarios could represent what ifs of what if we were promoting more development in the state that promoted more jobs development, or the inverse of that. What if we had more strict siting and permitting requirements, so we couldn't locate as many resources around the state? That would be representing more priority on environmental justice considerations. And so we can represent a variety of different priorities across what is a very multi-objective problem by constraining our scenarios differently and looking at different what-if questions.
That's great. And Jeremy, are you going to cover this a little bit more on your side as well?
Yeah, somewhat. So when we're talking about land use and natural resources, as Michael mentioned, we are not modeling down to the individual site level where we could be thinking, is it an investment in this location or that location? The geography we're using is just two zones in Oregon. It's an east and west zone, but the data that's coming into the model is built up from very disaggregated granular data sets where we're using land use layers to say, can we develop in one place versus another place, and calculating the potential to locate wind and solar and other resources around the state. And so that's one of the key things, that when we're trying to characterize our land use and natural resource constraints, we want to know where can we develop, and in thinking about what if questions, which may be the second meeting of the land use group, thinking about what if that looked different. So if it were more constrained where we can put resources, how might it be more constrained? What would be the factors that determine the megawatts of different resources that we could build?
Mhm. Thanks, Jeremy. Anne, thank you for that question, and please bring it up again if you kind of see an avenue for that. I'm going to go to Andrew and then Natalia.
Thank you. And I apologize. I think this question is going to come from a little bit of ignorance. I'm not necessarily advocating for one thing or another, but I just would like to understand. I think I asked a question in the last meeting, and it was about kind of the different types or technologies of solar that could be implemented, in particular like rooftop commercial scale, rooftop residential scale versus utility scale solar. And I just know that, at least, I don't know if you're familiar with like Mark Jacobson out of Stanford, like he's put together these kind of energy scenarios for different states. And one of the things that kind of surprised me was that his model for Oregon shows just a lot of rooftop, residential rooftop and commercial scale rooftop solar. And so I guess my question is, when you mentioned that those types, I understand that those types of installations and facilities are more expensive to install than utility scale. But I guess, is that still the case for the actual like residential or commercial customer? And I guess that's my question too, is like, is it, I understand that it may be more expensive for the utility and maybe consumers as a whole, but for the specific customer that's installing that, is that still cheaper?
That's a great question. And I know that there's also an environmental justice and equity working group looking really closely at the energy wallet part of the analysis, but I think that's like a really good question in terms of like rate impacts, which we're seeing as a major driver. Jeremy, do you want to sort of dive into that? And I'm not sure if your slides are going to cover it this time, but we could also loop back in the second meeting too.
Yeah, that's also a great question. And I think the last time around, Andrea, I was talking in terms of long-term and short-term in thinking about that in the short term, definitely the rates that exist right now and the economics for the customer are going to be what drives the adoption of rooftop solar. It has been the way that rooftop solar adoption has been driven in the last few years. And so we definitely don't want to be in the short term trying to model this on a societal or total resource cost basis, because we know that there'll be a bunch of adoption of rooftop solar systems. And we think that would continue into the future. So it's very rate dependent. We don't know what the rates will look like in the long term. But if we think about moving into the long term, then rates are something that is just another tool in the toolbox that either serves us in a transition to a lower carbon future, or it's not serving us. And if it's not serving us, then that's something that needs to be revised, and rate making needs to be set such that it's achieving the objectives that we want to see in the state. And that's a very multi-objective problem too, where there's large equity concerns, there's cost recovery across different types of infrastructure, and there's incentivizing customers to adopt technology in a particular way. And so when we're looking out to 2050, we can't rely on rates looking like they are today and incentivizing behavior that we would see today. But we do want to base rooftop solar adoption on something. So we're using the adoption forecast that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council is forecasting for rooftop adoption. And then we're allowing our model to build economically beyond that if it wants to. And typically it doesn't want to because it's competing against some cheaper resources. But in those situations that might arise in some of the what if question scenarios that we do, where maybe we're limited in transmission build, we're limited in siting new renewables, building more rooftop systems is a way of taking the stress off what is a large uncertainty around siting and permitting grid scale resources. So that is a way that like the model can fall back on that if it can't find grid scale resources to invest in. But primarily the adoption is forecasted rather than economically driven in the model because of those factors.
Thanks for the question, Andrew. And also it feels like you already are helping out with the what if question, so thanks for that too. In terms of one of our purposes and trying to get the working group's head around the model is to start sort of having this like, well, what if the scenario was this or that? So really appreciate that line of thinking. I'm going to go to Natalia and then Michael.
Morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I want to clarify a question from the kickoff meeting. How would you consider climate change scenarios in this model? Because I attended one of the meeting and because of the temperature in the summer is increasing now. So it was mentioned that because we need to use air conditioners, so energy demand is increased approximately by 30%. So it's directly affect basically energy modeling or greenhouse gases calculation that you will do. Yeah, particularly if we project it to 2050. So that's the first question. If you can clarify, will you consider and how you will consider? And that's lead to the second question, that greenhouse gases emission calculation. So it's not clear for me what is a base year you will use. I mean, reduction compare with which year, and if you will consider using IPCC methodology for greenhouse gases calculation, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is international methodology that usually each country calculate emissions from energy sectors and land use change sector, and also submit from the national level under the Paris Agreement commitments, let's say. So if you will consider that methodology and tools that they're using, because it would be good also to incorporate and maybe in the future to report to the national level once they calculate it. Yeah, so and usually in IPCC methodology, they use 1990 baseline year, or country can choose 2005 or some other year. So I'm wondering how you can connect climate change scenarios if you plan to consider them, and what the baseline for the energy calculation, greenhouse gases emission calculation, and what methodology if you will consider IPCC methods.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So on the first part of the question, thinking about climate change being incorporated into the model, there are, I would say, three main ways. One is that in the underlying data sets that are used to determine service demands, then there are, and we're using annual energy outlook for the forecast going forward, then there are changes in heating degree days and cooling degree days that are correspondent to one of the IPCC scenarios. I can't remember which one, but it's not the super optimistic one. It's something in the middle. So that's changing service demand for a particular, say, a house that has heating and cooling systems already. There's also growth in the number of air conditioners that are going in. And so that's reflected in the underlying data set as well. But that's one area where I want to do a little bit of review, just because in the AEO data set that we're using for that forecast, it is for the Pacific Census Division, and Oregon is likely to see more cooling adoption than places that already have a lot of cooling, like California, that also fall into that census division. And then the third is on the supply side. So we are working on building in, and the main way that is coming into the model is in hydro, so hydro availability. We're working with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council on work they recently did to look at the incorporation of climate change into hydro availability. So that'll be an update to the way that we used to do it. We'll be representing low, medium, and high hydro years in the model, and there'll be a frequency with which those occur in the future. And it's in development right now, but we are thinking about how we incorporate that. The data is kind of sparse on representation for that, but I think that the Power Council's work could be very useful. And then on the second part of the question, Executive Order 2004 is relative to 1990 levels. And the method of accounting for that is dependent on the Oregon GHG emissions inventory. And so it differs somewhat with what you would use for compliance with international standards, just because at a federal level, you would be using land sink and the changes in the land sink over time for overall emissions. When you're using the emissions inventory for accounting, then it is anthropogenic emissions. And so it's reductions in the human produced emissions over time, not factoring in Oregon's what is quite a large land sink. But there's opportunity in this study for looking at other scenarios where we're going to 95% or net zero, something more aggressive than the 80%. And we will have to modify the accounting or the rules, at least for compliance, somewhat in that scenario, just because it will be necessary to do some kind of negative emissions technologies or land-based improvements in the sink, like NCS, or carbon capture, sequestration, direct air capture, just because it will not be possible to meet a more stringent emission standard without those things. But in the 80% scenario, then we don't have sequestration, we don't have DAC, we don't have NCS. It's really a reduction in the energy-based emissions that is being used to comply with that.
That's great. And I know that there's a slide on carbon management. Natalia, when that slide comes up, I'd welcome you to sort of revisit this and ask another question as well. I'm going to go to Michael, and then we might move into more of like a put your comments in the chat so we can get to Jeremy's slides, but this has been really useful from my perspective. Go ahead, Michael.
Good morning. Thanks, everyone. I was wondering how you were planning to model equity issues and how you're defining that. I was kind of struck in reviewing some of the previous annual updates on the strategic plan that I found on the ODO website that I don't believe that you've really addressed as a topic data centers and crypto mining. I would recommend that there was a recent report, articles put by Republica and the Seattle Times on data centers and crypto demands in Washington State, and it's pretty staggering. And they were framing it as an equity issue, you know, all of this renewable energy that may be developed going to data centers as opposed to residential use or regular commercial use, and just sucking up so much of our new renewable energy. I'm just wondering how something like that gets modeled and then considered as in the scenarios. Thank you.
Yes.
That's a great article. Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
It's a good question. So we we are going to rely on other forecasts for what's happening in data center, crypto, chip manufacturing. It is something that we do in-house, but the Power Council has also done analysis where they're collecting forecasts that are coming from the utilities and then developing a forecast out on how they think these different factors are going to impact loads over time. But the error bars around that are very large. And so there's definitely opportunity for scenarios that are looking at quite big swings in the forecast error there. And there are factors on the equity side that may swing the desirability of having those. There's also factors on the economic side that would determine where these things go. And on the equity side, there's two sides of that coin. The one that you mentioned, where we're doing a lot of development of resources that are potentially impactful in terms of environmental justice for new loads that could be going somewhere else. But it's also on the flip side of the coin, there's job development, economic development that are associated with that. So again, this broad spectrum of different costs and benefits. And then on the economic side, the uncertainty is kind of defined by where it makes sense for these data centers to be going. And so far, the Northwest has been quite attractive because of low-cost hydropower. But depending on how rules play out, that hydropower is clean electricity that could be going to other loads. Also, the marginal resource that's getting built is new renewables. That's going to change the cost equation. And there are other factors like new data centers typically get built next to old data centers. They get built next to telecommunications infrastructure and near pools of labor that work on data centers. And if those factors become less favorable, then within a 6-month period, large-scale data center growth that was earmarked for Oregon may go to some other state. And so it's just really hard to predict, and that's very impactful for utility planning. But ultimately, the way that we are factoring in the equity concerns is that in our modeling, which is the sort of the high-level 2-zone modeling in Oregon, it's not thinking specifically about where these things are getting built, other than the underlying data sets are constraining us on how much could get built. That then goes into on the modeling side, this energy wallet analysis. What is the impact on particular customer energy bills? And then it's also going into the equity work that CETI is doing on where these things are going and what the impact on different populations might look like. And I'm not the expert on that part. I would, if Ruby wants to share any details on that, you can jump in there.
I would just flag that we have the EJ and Equity Working Group meeting tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about that in more detail. But as Jeremy said, yeah, there's the energy wallet analysis, and then we're also doing some mapping work that is looking at current socioeconomic indicators in Oregon, along with some energy burden data.
I'll also just mention that, it's a topic, as you mentioned in the Seattle Times, it's taking up a lot of thoughts in a lot of different places, and there might not be the perfect modeling piece to this, but we have a phase 2 on policy, where I think I would be surprised if it didn't come up, and so I appreciate you raising that. Okay, I think I'm gonna shift us over back to the slide deck, but this has been really useful. Please continue to ask these types of engaging questions in the chat, and we'll kind of, as you're seeing the slides, we'll pull them together and do some pauses and covering them. So thanks again for your engagement on that. Next slide, I think is, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know we just spent time kind of going over this process, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on revisiting this, and we went over this in the first working group. If anything, I want to make sure we're sharing these slides and you can refer back to kind of where we are in this process. We are at the beginning and kind of beginning of a long process to develop the energy strategy. We've developed 8 working groups. We're meeting now with the goal of coming up with a draft kind of modeling proposal based on all these meetings. So this meeting, this group in particular, we're meeting today. We're going to meet next week, and then we'll be bringing everybody together again in a final meeting, trying to get to that end proposal. And I do want to highlight the goal of these meetings isn't necessarily to get consensus so much as we're trying to collect as much information as we can from all the working group members and take that information in and then be able to demonstrate what we've heard in those final meetings, and with that combined modeling draft proposal at the end. So let's go to the next slide here. And then another thing I wanted to highlight is just the complexity of this, and that, you know, we were just talking about the challenges in incorporating equity and environmental justice with this, and there are a variety of different issues within the energy world that we want to incorporate, and that the bill certainly demands that we do. And it's important to include all this stuff. And I want to highlight that even if there aren't direct data and assumptions in the modeling itself, the way we look at it, the lens through what we look at the results and interpret them, will certainly take all these different things into account, and they're certainly all very important to us. And we've talked about kind of the policy objectives. I do want to stress again, all the existing Oregon policies will be used and built upon to make our reference scenario. And so that's essentially our baseline that we'll be comparing everything to get to that goal, that end goal of the 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. That's from Executive Order 2004. A lot of the growth and a lot of those reductions are going to be from House Bill 2021 and the Climate Protection Program, as well as a lot of these other great Oregon policies that are existing that'll drive change. And we're making some additional assumptions beyond that. And we'll talk about some of those assumptions of the reference case today. And Jeremy will be presenting on that soon. And just to kind of revisit the modeling approach. So the reference scenario, I think of it as our baseline, but essentially it's the foundation that we test everything against. And so we're going to talk today about that kind of reference case and what we think will get us there and what we're going to test against. And so it's incredibly important to kind of remember that and think about that it's using existing policies, and that if there are additional things we want to do beyond that kind of reference at baseline, we can certainly do that in the scenarios, and we can talk about those what if questions. Okay. So now, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of go through the data assumptions within the reference case related to land use.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I have a few slides here that I'll try to move relatively quickly through. There's a recap in the beginning of just what our modeling approach is, and that's recapping material that we've seen already at the kickoff meeting. Then looking at what are the ways that land use and natural resources are fitting into the modeling that we're doing, and what might be the opportunities for input from this group to shape the study. So high-level modeling approach, we're starting with this model of Oregon's economy. It's this bottom-up representation of all the energy-consuming technologies across all the subsectors. And then we're putting assumptions into the model on how we think that these stocks are going to change over time. And that's largely based on sales share. So it's making assumptions about when somebody's going to the dealership, are they buying an electric vehicle or are they buying a internal combustion engine vehicle? And we apply that kind of logic across all the different subsectors. Then moving from 2024 through 2050 and applying those assumptions, we get these stock changes, the transformation of how people are consuming energy. And if we roll up all of that demand to that second bucket on the chart there, we get our electricity demand, we get liquid fuel demand, we get our gaseous fuels demand. And based on that demand, we then move into our supply side model, which is a capacity expansion and operations model, to work out how do we supply all of those different forms of energy at least cost and reliably, constrained by the clean energy goals, constrained by the emissions goals, and constrained by the specific assumptions in each scenario that may be defining other objectives. Like we talked about in the beginning, scenarios could be representing different policy priorities where we want to limit the amount of renewables being built, or different types of proxies for these other objectives that the state might be concerned about. Next slide. So putting that modeling process, which is the middle bar in this diagram, into the context of the data needs, we've worked with data holders over the last month on the bottom part of that chart there, the best available data, looking for the data sets that best characterize the underpinnings of both the demand side and the supply side model. So these are things like, what are the service demands for different types of energy? Heat, light, cooling, steam, all of those different things, how those might evolve over time based on changes in population, climate impacts, etc. And then what are the technologies available for customers who are replacing a particular piece of technology, and their characteristics, their costs, the hourly demand shapes. And then on the supply side, something similar, where we're just capturing the current energy system. What do the supply chains look like for all of the various types of fuels and electricity in the economy? What are the technology options that Oregon could invest in over time to supply energy of different types? And the costs, operating parameters, etc., of all of those technologies. And then moving on to the top part of this diagram, these are the scenario assumptions. So the things that might change between scenarios. And if you think about the what if questions that Ruchi was teeing up in the beginning, that would frame the different types of questions we think are most important for the energy strategy. These scenario assumptions are the translation of that important question into the quantitative scenario inputs that will best address that question. So these are things like, on the demand side, electric vehicle sales. How do those change over time? How might they differ between scenarios? The impact of policies on those inputs. So the impact of things like IRA on electric vehicle sales. Supply side assumptions. So the example here is resource availability, and that's one that we mentioned already today. A scenario could be representing the uncertainty about whether we can cite and permit resources across Oregon in total. So how much could we get built? And also the rate constraints, how fast can we build out these resources? And that could represent the uncertainty, or it could represent policy priorities to say, let's exclude more land and see how Oregon would meet its emissions targets if we can't develop, for example, on prime farmland. And then all of this is constrained by our emissions targets. It's constrained by our clean electricity targets, and feeds into our model to give us a set of different outputs across the scenarios that, when we compare them, we can look at the trade-offs, we can look at what we need to do more of and less of in the different scenarios, and learn something that can inform policymakers about near-term policy setting. Next slide. So a word about, and this is getting to the question that Michael had in the beginning, the treatment of forecasting and this term backcasting in the model. This helps us understand where the decisions that different assumptions on the land use and resources side might factor into the modeling. Forecasting, this is projecting changes based on expected customer behavior or incentives, technologies, the result of current policy going forward. And so this is more like simulating where we would get to based on current conditions today, but that doesn't necessarily get us to the policy goals that we want to achieve in the future. And so backcasting starts at the end point. We want to get to those emissions goals. We want to get it to our clean electricity goals. And if we work backwards from that point and think about what is the best pathway to be on, knowing that something about the future, that we want to get to that point, then what are the things that will best set us up for success? And looking at the chart on the right-hand side there, this is illustrating that depending on the type of technology investment that we're making in the economy, we only have a certain number of bites of the apple. So if we're talking about appliances in buildings with a 10-year lifetime, maybe we have 2 or 3 bites of the apple before we get to reaching those emissions goals. AC and furnaces, a little less. Vehicles, maybe a customer is replacing their vehicle once or twice in the next 25 years. Boilers, this is even more so. If we're investing in a boiler today, then it's going to be around in the 2040s. And then power plants, which is of particular interest when we're talking about land use and where resources can go. If we build a power plant today, then it's likely going to be around in 2050. And so recognizing that, then thinking about what is the impact of different land use constraints is important for developing that pathway and making sure we're not investing in dead ends along the way. Next slide. We could skip this one because I just talked through all of this. So next slide. Okay, so natural land use and natural resources. We could break this down into a couple of areas, and I will add one that's not on the slide at the end here. But first of all, resource siting. So as I mentioned, we're operating at this pretty aggregated granularity. We have 2 Oregon zones, but the details that are going into defining how much of a particular resource we could invest in is built from a very disaggregated level. So it is small geographic cells that are constituted of different types of land use, different types of restriction, depending on what type of habitat exists there, what sort of socioeconomic constraints might be present there. And based on different screens of where we can locate different resources, and we can build up a potential for how much of different types of resources can be put into Oregon. And then spatial planning is another way that land use and natural resources filter in here. This is programs of where do we zone new development, what type of infrastructure are we building of other types, so transportation infrastructure, public transportation, the way that we plan the future built environment in Oregon, and how does that impact our energy demands. And one way that it impacts it is through vehicle miles traveled. We don't represent the built environment or the economy beyond energy and emissions in our model, but what we can represent is the result of policies that produce changes here. And so if in a particular scenario we want to model changes in VMT reductions, then we can do that. We just won't be determining exactly what we need to do on the spatial planning side to accomplish that outcome. Next slide. Okay, so near-term decisions in the long-term context. There's this play between the things that we know are going to happen in the near term, and we want to represent those in the model. So incorporating planned resource additions that utilities have identified in the near term, incorporating that forecasted rooftop PV, distributed generation additions, our demand side transformation assumptions. So how is the way that we consume energy changing? The cost estimates of new resources and transmission. So not only are we thinking about where can these resources go, but also how are costs for those resources impacted if you have different topology, if you different types of land use, potential fire risk on different types of land. we're looking at in-state versus out-of-state opportunities. So if we're constrained on building within Oregon, what are the opportunities for building outside of Oregon and importing clean energy of different types into the state? And our biomass opportunities are represented by a supply curve. The baseline data that we have in there is the DOE billion ton study for the potential for different types of biomass. That's a question for this group. Are there resources for Oregon specific biomass potential that we should be incorporating here that we don't currently have? Next slide. And so just laying out the input opportunities on the land use and natural resources side. The first is what level of resource siting restriction should be incorporated into the model. We have done past modeling that has used NREL data, but more recently we have used the Nature Conservancy Power Place West study, which was a study that Evolved did and was published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. And it used that approach of the very disaggregated cells, multiple different screening levels to identify where resources could go. Oregon has the ERISA tool that does that same thing, where there's a variety of different screens on where different resources could be located. And the question would be, if we wanted to build scenarios using that tool, what type of screen should be incorporated into our reference case? And if we wanted to look at other cases in other scenarios, for example, a more restricted siting and permitting scenario, then what additional screens beyond the reference scenario should we incorporate? If we looked at VMT savings, what sort of VMT savings should we assume? The what if questions, so that I think that'll be a focus of the second meeting, but potentially teed up today. What are those questions that would be most important for us to answer with the study? And then when we're thinking about the analysis that could follow this analysis, there's the opportunity for looking at more detailed consideration of siting impacts by taking our two-zone builds and then downscaling them back to the locations for resources that were identified through the ERISA tool work. Next slide. Okay, so a quick word on Power Place West to just give a flavor on the type of analysis here that we could do with the ERISA tool. So in that study, we assumed 3 different levels of exclusion for new resources. Level 1 was the most permissive, down to level 3, the strictest. And level 1 was the protections there were just the legally protected areas. So things like wildlife refuges, national parks, marine sanctuaries. Then level 2 added additional restrictions that had administrative and legal designations, or where state or federal law requires consultation or review, and including the sites that NGOs have identified as sensitive. And so examples here included land that had threatened or endangered species on it, critical habitat, priority habitat management areas. And then level 3 added an additional level of screening where it included areas of high conservation value. And that wasn't just in terms of environmental impact, but also economic, social, cultural value. And so additional screens were things like prime farmland, important bird areas, big game priority habitat. And we move to the next slide. We can see the result of that screening here, where the green colors are the area of land that is screened out. So at siting level 1, we see in Oregon, we don't have too much land screened out when we're just thinking about the legally restricted areas. Siting level 2, there is a lot more land that is screened out. There's still a lot of potential in Oregon. And then siting level 3 is screening out a large portion of the land within Oregon, and in that case, a lot of the renewables were located on subprime farmland. Move to the next slide. I've included slides here for sources of screens. There's 3 slides here. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but it shows the types of geospatial land use screen that were used to overlay and intersect and find the areas that renewables could be developed. And in sharing these slides, then people could look at that in more detail. But the real takeaway here is if this group has ideas about what our scenarios should look like in terms of screens for this study, that would be really valuable for us to be able to characterize both our reference scenario, what is kind of a likely scenario going forward, and then a more restrictive scenario of if we encounter barriers to being able to develop new renewables, what are the likely causes of those barriers, and so what additional screens should we add to the mix there. And we could skip through these screening slides here, Michael. And so finally, ending on the ERISA tool, I kind of summarized this already, but we have this opportunity in Oregon from the extensive work done characterizing different land use layers in the state to be able to produce our own scenarios here. And but it is an important step that we need to take to be able to characterize what are the actual screens that would best characterize a reference in a more restrictive case. And so that's where we would look for input on this. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Michael.
Hey, Michael, before getting into your slides, there's a few questions that came in. Would this be a good time to pause? That's okay with you?
I think this is a great time to have a discussion and kind of break down, I guess, answer what's in the chat, and then let's talk about kind of what we just went over as far as the power place and the filters and how to look at land use.
Great. So Jeremy, there's 3 questions that came in. The first one was around whether the model will look at utilizing existing capacity on the grid for transmission and distribution, and thinking about siting renewables in Oregon, and then without any layers of constraint around land use or otherwise, how land use and others will be a lever for the scenarios. And then Amy also asked if we have a way to look at out-of-state energy sources and Oregonians exporting externalities with out-of-state energy imports. So maybe we can cover that one first and then go to the next one.
So cover the last one first?
Actually, Amy, do you want to just come off mute and see if some of this might have been covered in the most recent slide. So if you wanted to.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that some of these things have been covered, but maybe just to clarify. So I believe other groups are probably talking about this, but will the model show like what we could develop potentially without any restrictions? Is that our base case scenario? And then the other restrictions are the levers. Am I understanding that correctly?
The reference scenario will have restrictions. We want it to be realistic about where we can put renewables in the state. And so, but the question would be, what is the land use that we should be filtering out because we would not be able to develop on that going forward in the reference case. And then in a what if scenario where we're saying, what if it were even more restrictive than that? Then the question would be, what are the additional land use restrictions that we should put on for that scenario?
Okay, thank you. And what is the reason for adding more restrictions? Is that for incorporating other type of justice issues we're looking at, or is that for kind of thinking about more restrictive policy that might be coming? What's the reason for that?
Well, so I I am kind of putting words in your mouth by saying that. It doesn't need to be a scenario that we look at if this group doesn't think that that's an important issue to consider. That's just an example of a particular what if question that we could ask with the model, where we could say, what if it were harder to site and permit renewables? And that question in itself could be representative of a variety of different issues that all have the same outcome. So one story for why that might happen would be that the state adopts more restrictive siting and permitting policy. It could be that processes to site and permit resources are overwhelmed by the number of applications, can't keep up with it. So those would be more policy and regulatory based reasons. It could also be that from an environmental or a social justice perspective, that it is just harder to locate these or site these resources, and it may well become harder over time, where the kind of easier to develop sites are taken up in the first few years, and then later on you get to more contentious siting challenges. And so the model itself is quite, when we're looking at this from an aggregated perspective in just 2 zones, the result could represent the answer to a variety of questions there that could either represent uncertainty about whether these things get built, or it could represent different policy choices or restrictions based on all of these other externalities that we could incorporate.
One other quick follow-up on that. Does the model take into account proximity to the grid and siting?
Yeah, so it's in our current data set, which is based on PowerPlace West, then the interconnection cost is based on the proximity to the existing power system. And it's not super detailed. It's basically a point-to-point measure of how far it is from backbone transmission at the moment, and that acts as a proxy for an estimate of the interconnection cost for a resource. And that interconnection cost is impacted by what kind of land use the resource is getting sited on. If we're using the ERISA tool to update where resources are going, then we will be kind of redoing that point-to-point analysis based on the screening that happens with the ERISA tool.
Thank you. And my final question that I put in the chat was, will we be looking at potential externalities of bringing, like exporting or importing our energy from other states, like exporting our externalities?
So as in if we are importing clean energy from another place, that the development of that clean energy in another state has externalities associated with it.
Yeah, like if their land use laws aren't as strong, they're not protecting their natural resources as much, the community doesn't want them, or they're getting too many renewables in their communities, and we're not citing them here.
So we're not tracking that in the model. We're tracking whether the import is coming from a clean energy source or not. So the emissions are taken care of. And on the liquid fuel side, then we're tracking the carbon content of the fuel. So under Executive Order 2004, the import of a clean fuel would be a zero emissions fuel. So any emissions associated with production or credit associated with that fuel, say it were from BECCS, where there's a sequestration component, the credit for that would be left in the state of origin, and it would be just zero emissions coming in. Under CPP, you have a emissions factor associated with the production of different clean fuels, and that gets it partially at what you're describing, where it's about the land use change that's happened to produce that fuel. And so there is an emissions factor associated with the change in land use. But to capture other externalities. So in your example, where they may have more permissive siting and permitting processes that could have other externalities, I think that would have to be captured in our modeling by saying, what would you want to see instead in a scenario that prioritizes those externalities? And maybe that is more development in state in Oregon, but in areas that are compliant with that more the stricter siting and permitting. So it would be a case that we don't often run, but one where we have very restrictive siting potential in Oregon, but we can only site in Oregon, or we have a major in-state requirement there, in which case we might see a lot of offshore wind development happening just because the energy has to come from somewhere, and that may be the blowout valve that's happening, that plus rooftop solar. So it would be a more maybe distributed plus offshore wind scenario.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming, Amy. Let's see, the next one was from Mike about how the model will select energy sources when we compare imported energy versus energy produced in state. Is this only decided by the lowest cost?
Yes, it is just decided by lowest cost unless we are constrained by what we do. So we have the availability in the model of constraints to say you can only get a certain percentage of your renewable energy from out of state. That's not currently a restriction in Oregon, and so we would be modeling without that as the default. But we can either restrict the renewable energy credits that could qualify from out of state. We could physically restrict the amount of transmission build to other states, or we could require a certain amount of in-state development. So there's a variety of ways that we could constrain Oregon to do a more homegrown solution to meeting the targets, but default it is a cost selection. What is the lowest cost way of meeting Oregon's clean energy needs?
Mike, I see you nodding, but do you have any other follow-up on that one?
No, that pretty much gets to it there. I just kind of an underlying question there is, does the model assume if we're generating power in Oregon, that power stays in Oregon, or does it just go into your regional context there, which is probably likely more the case?
Yeah, it doesn't assume it stays in Oregon. In fact, the model is building out a portfolio across the West that is going to be lowest cost, and that means building complementary resources. And so Oregon will likely have periods of producing more energy than it can consume, and it will be exporting to other places. And conversely, there'll be times when Oregon will be importing because other resources around the West are producing when Oregon has less output. And so it's being solved as if there is one system operator for the West, which is, not the current system, but it would be the system that ideally we'd like to go to. And when we're looking long term, that makes more sense to be thinking about the ideal operations of the electricity grid rather than constraining it by current friction across multiple system operators and transmission operators.
Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, Mike, for the question. Definitely keep them coming. Natalia had a question about the name of the model that was answered in the chat by Ruby. I'll just verbalize that Evolved used two of their own modeling tools. Energy Pathways is the scenario analysis tool that calculates energy demand, and RIO, which stands for Regional Investment and Operations, is a capacity expansion tool that calculates future energy supply. And then Lauren had a question about whether we're going to incorporate findings and rules from current state and rulemaking and federal processes in place that are looking at least conflict areas for siting, such as the Eastern Oregon Solar RAC and the BLM PEIS. Jeremy, do you want to cover that one?
Yeah, so I think that that's great input for us in if that is a priority that we should include, then I think that's a layer from ORISA that is important for us to be capturing. So I would say that our thinking around that is not at the state where I can say, yes, we thought about that and that's definitely going in. I think your input there is what we're looking for, and that would be super valuable to hear, as well as any other input from others about what are priorities that you'd like to see included in layering up different types of land use.
I'm going to totally agree with Jeremy and also add that one of our constraints in this project, Lauren, might be the timing. So the Oregon Solar RAC over at DLCD might not come to conclusion in time for the model to be run. So we'd look to you and others who are participating in that to let us know, thoughts there. I think that's a great area of feedback for this group. Similar to the BLM PEIS, I think the last I checked, maybe there's a draft out with some alternatives. So depending on the status of that one it'd be helpful to get feedback from this group on treatment there. And just generally to say, the model will be running a sort of a snapshot in time. And, maybe we can do this again one day and incorporate more recent policy or sort of regulatory issues. But thank you for the question. And I think that's a great area of feedback. Do you have anything else you wanted to add, Lauren? Or did we cover? I saw you nodding, but just wanted to check.
Oh, no, you covered it. That's important for for us to consider too with the timeline. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. John asked, beyond listed habitat, are considerations made for state identified habitat, thinking specifically of ODFW identified habitat that may not include listed species but are critical nonetheless? Sounds like that's going towards sort of like a siting specific layer. I think, Jeremy, you're not sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be, again, input here that this group determines to be important. And it sounds like that's another example that we should be thinking about when building the maps of availability of renewables.
Mm-hmm. And John, I think it would be good for us to look at power of place and maybe what is there. And then also the ORISA tool. The ORISA tool has some ODFW specifically generated data sets. So it'd be maybe good to look into that in between our meetings or work group meetings and get feedback on what the model, should consider there. John, did you have anything else on that, or did we cover?
No, that covers it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kelly asks, will you be using the state wetland inventory, which includes national wetland inventory? Due to a biological opinion, it would be necessary to include FEMA floodplains. Might be kind of a similar area of feedback. We'd be looking to this group for help in terms of which GIS layers and whether they're in ORISA or power of place and how to sort of consider that. Is that right, Jeremy?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Nolan asked, do the models factor in potentially deconstructing the Snake River dams? My apologies, it was covered, but had a couple calls. It's okay, Nolan. I don't think we've covered that. So Jeremy, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, we are assuming that they remain in the reference case. It's the modeling of the hydro system without the Snake River dams is challenging for us because we don't have a detailed nodal representation of the river network to say that how it's going to change the availability of hydro. But there's an option to include a generic reduction in hydro. So we could say it still has the same capabilities and shape as before, but now it's a generic reduction of 3 gigawatts or however much we want to reduce the hydro capacity and represent it that way.
Although we're not planning on doing that.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly respond to that. I just know there's been ongoing conversations at the federal level, and want to be cognizant of if something moves forward that we are also considering that.
Nolan. I think that the reference case is kind of how Jeremy described it as sort of what's reasonably assumed right now based on current policy. So that feels like another sort of, depending on how the timing would go compared to when this model is run, sounds like there's a lot more sort of left to do on that among the federal government. I will say that the question around the less availability of hydro in terms of a what if question for the future might be a way to sort of address multiple considerations around hydro. The earlier question that was asked around climate change and how climate change would affect many things in our state, I think includes the availability of hydro, given that we might see a reduction in snowpack, which is what, hydropower dams really rely on. So there might be a lot of reasons that we might hear feedback from this working group or others to consider a what if around hydro availability. Does that help, Nolan?
Anne, do you have a question?
Yeah, I figured I'd just ask it rather than spend the time in typing it into the chat at this point.
Please do.
Jeremy, I heard you suggest that because of Oregon's land use planning restrictions and restrictions like for habitat on terrestrial ecosystems, that we may end up opting for offshore wind as a blowout scenario. But I'm wondering, are you considering values of marine ecosystems and economies? In my observation, in powers of place, these values seem to be underrepresented. And I was just looking quickly in ORESA, and it looks like although some of these are listed, there's kind of two options. One says context or analyze, which I don't know what that really means, but I've just been sort of encountering that whole realm of stuff more. And I just know there's a lot of stuff out there that does not seem to be represented. So just wanted to ask you that question.
Yeah, I think if we were to run a scenario like that, which again it's a choice in this working group process on whether we have this limited resource scenario, then we can talk about what are the restrictions in building out the offshore wind resource as well. And it may be that, as you're saying, and I don't know the full details on what we have and haven't on restrictions there, but we could limit that to a certain number of gigawatts that is representative of what this group or other working groups deem as a restrictive scenario for offshore wind. So we have the option of whatever input we want to include in there. It would be an interesting scenario if we have limited grid scale onshore. We can't build out transmission, we can't build the offshore, because then we are in a feasibility bind, most likely for Oregon, where there are clean electricity targets, there are emissions targets, but the challenge of where does the energy come from will be a dominant one. And we'll have to look out for ways that the model gets around doing that may be not desirable in Oregon. And one of them, there's trade-offs between sending clean energy via transmission lines and sending clean energy via pipelines. And one way would be to send more clean energy via hydrogen-derived fuels or biofuels that are coming from other places for energy production, including electricity production inside of Oregon. And that might not be a desirable scenario, but it would be looking for the ways that we could both meet the targets and do so with very restrictive renewables. And so I think it would be an interesting scenario that we probably learn quite a bit from.
And any follow-up from you, or did that cover it for now?
That didn't really cover it in my mind at all, but I guess I was just looking at, it seems like you're using power of place as an example of how you look at things like land use restrictions and constraints, but the answer that you just gave sort of suggested that we're not going to be able to get to any of that kind of thing in this model, maybe because of the east-west constraint. But anyway, I guess I was sort of thinking that I'm still trying to understand how you incorporate the land use restrictions to accomplish some of the things that we all value as Oregonians fit in if we can't, are we going to get to that level of modeling? I guess if you're using spatial planning, I'm a little bit confused now by that response.
Yep. So the ERISA tool is a set of layers that we can pick which ones we're going to be using to restrict development at a very granular level in the state. And at the moment, we don't have scenarios to say that the reference scenario is going to be this set of layers. And if in the working group process, we identify a more restrictive scenario as being desirable, then what are the set of layers that characterize that? Those are currently those sets of layers are things that we have not yet identified. And from what I'm hearing from you, the layers in ERISA are not sufficient to represent the marine environment challenges that could be represented in a restrictive scenario. And so all I'm describing is that if this group or other working groups wants to restrict the opportunity for offshore wind more so than what the ERISA tool is giving us the opportunity to do, then we can put whatever restriction that we want in there that comes from other sources as well. And so it is not just it's not just ERISA based, or it's based on whatever the working groups identify as the desirable scenario definition.
If I could build on that, Jeremy, also for my own understanding, because similar to working group members, I'm also learning about the tool and what it can do in some of our previous projects. So is one way to think about it is, the modeling that is being done using the energy pathways, which is a scenario analysis to connect, energy demand. That's like one big thing, like how much energy demand will we be expecting over 2050? And then Rio capacity expansion to understand future energy supply. On the future energy supply piece, thinking about what that future energy supply, the GIS layers can help us understand which technologies and sort of where to affect that energy supply. So as you're screening out potential land or water for development, that would affect the energy supply. Is that one way to think about it, as compared to the output of the model, which is, showing renewables or different types of options for sort of meeting demand, but not at the granular level that we were talking about with the layers. Is that sort of like a big picture kind of orientation of where this shows up?
Yeah. So if we take Western Oregon as an example, or actually let's take Eastern Oregon as an example, and all of our land use layers are overlapping on very small packets of land, such that there are only a certain number of packets of land available to locate renewables because we've screened out a variety of different sites. Then the potential for new renewable development will be the sum of the available wind, the sum of the available solar across those sites. And those renewables will be broken up into different bins because the conditions on those different packets that are left over are going to be different depending on what the available solar, what the available wind is there. And so we'll have different bins of resource quality. So some sites will be poor quality, they'll have low capacity factors, the wind won't blow very often, and other sites will be higher resource quality. And so what our model will see that comes in from that detailed packet level analysis will be the sum of all of the megawatts available of resource quality 1 and the sum of all of the megawatts available of resource quality 2, and so on. And then the shape of the output, hourly output. So the shape differs as well. In one place, the wind might be blowing when in another part of the state, it's not. And so the shape is important. And so that will also be an input into our model too. But that's the process of getting from the detailed model inputs development process that is at the packet level into the inputs that are actually used by the model, which is operating on these much larger zones. Does that make sense?
I'm curious, Michael, if you could switch over to slide 24 just to kind of give that visual of what Jeremy was talking about in terms of the option with looking at power of place.
Yeah, so in this diagram, the green is what has been screened out based on the particular types of land use screen. And the white parts that are left over are where you can locate new resources.
So speaking to the marine piece, I can see in like offshore, there's some green areas there. So the white would be potential availability of new resources. And as you screen out more due to the assumptions around the GIS layers, it looks like those resources become less and less available. So on like number 3, I see a lot more green around the.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Really,
I know we don't have a ton of time today, but I mean, even if you think about this more and want to come back with public comment or send us a note or something like that, or we can talk about it in our next meeting as well. But this is really an opportunity to let us know between these layers for a reference case, how, what's the likelihood of having available land for these resources, and what can we do here, and how restrictive or unrestricted should we be within this?
And so to sort of rephrase it as well, thanks, Michael, like the reference case, we're sort of looking to define with your help, what is sort of like reasonable to expect, not a business as usual, I keep saying that in my head, but more as like a reasonable set of assumptions around, the snapshot of right now versus the like what ifs around different screens or availability. And then kind of clicking through, Michael, just to sort of look again at slides 25, 26, and 27 of the types of, and I don't think these slides are online yet, but they will be, and we'll share them over email as well. But the different sources here, I know we're getting some detailed, really good questions about the sources. And when you see these, you can click on the URL and take a look that way. And then looking at the ERISA tool, there's metadata that has similar kind of availability of where this data source is coming from. I'm going to turn it over to Jack's question in the chat here. Will we be shown a model of the Western US energy supply and demand that might better inform what we want to do in Oregon to utilize renewable resources? If there are areas where renewable energy potential greatly exceeds renewable energy demand, then would we use that information in Oregon's model? Jeremy, I think you touched on this a little bit in terms of sort of the regional look, but do you want to kind of address that more specifically?
Yeah, so we are looking across the West when we're running the model, and the resources across the West are constrained by this same land use layer analysis. And so typically when we're running it, it is a land use layer analysis that is consistent across all of the states, but it doesn't have to be. So if it's a very restrictive scenario in Oregon, then in past analysis, we've tended to make that a restrictive everywhere kind of scenario. But we could also run scenario where it's more permissive other places, but in Oregon, it is restrictive. And there are states that even if you're looking at all of this different land use layer analysis, they still far exceed the potential. The resource potential far exceeds their loads, and the Southwest Solar would be a good example of that, where we can get large scale build out over there. There's also the question of transmission, though. So transmission at the same time is getting constrained by the opportunities for building it out. And so if we are constrained to, say, only reconductoring existing transmission lines because we can't build new greenfield, then we have limited opportunity of bringing resources or power from resources in other places into Oregon. So there's a variety of ways that we can constrain this to be more or less permissive for resource siting and permitting. The challenge being that there's competing objectives here. One being that these constraints represent valuable considerations around many of the externalities that we're talking about in the beginning, but that may be at loggerheads with achieving clean electricity and emissions goals if we can't cite resources sufficient to meet those energy demands. But in Power Place West analysis, that was not the case. We were able to meet the energy needs of the West, even with the most restrictive land use case.
Thank you. Jack, I kind of saw you nodding, but do you have any follow-up on that, or what do you think? And then I see Andrew's hand up. Andrew, is your question related to Jack's? Would it be good to go with that now?
I'm not so certain, but I guess if nobody else has a question, I'll go for it. But one of the things that I think I'd like to know how much detail could be provided is, so looking at the Power of Place maps, I know that it's it's kind of generalized in terms of showing that a lot of the area that is screened is green. And I was wondering if it's possible to kind of produce maps that will give people a little bit more information about why a particular area is screened. For Oregon, for example, is it, or the policy considerations around that. For example, I think it would be really helpful to have like private state land versus federal jurisdiction land kind of like mapped out on there and other things like that. So I was wondering if that's possible, if it's possible to create those types of maps based on the model inputs, or if there's a technical reason why that is getting too much in the weeds or something like that.
Michael, could you go back one slide, and then maybe we can use that slide to help answer the question too?
It's a good question. So the Power Place West stuff that is shown here in the slide deck is showing what we are, the starting point that we have in our model. So for the West, this is what we use in studies in the West for characterizing where we can build resources and what the potential and the characteristics of those resources are. But in this analysis, we have the ERISA tool as a resource in Oregon, and the ERISA tool has detailed land use layering in Oregon of the things that you're just describing. And so in using assumptions to define what is in the reference case, what is in potential other cases we might want to look at, then all of that wealth of data is available to show why a particular project was screened out. The intersection of whether it's on private lands, whether it is sensitive habitat area, whether it's X, Y, or Z, other types of land use constraint, all of that would be available to us to show graphically. the question is, though, that just which of those land use layers are important for us to characterize the resource opportunity in Oregon. But yeah, we would have a lot of data to be producing graphics that of the type that you're describing.
Okay, and just to follow up, because I think part of the reason is I think there's going to be a lot of assumptions built into whether or not things are available. And so I know lots of folks, probably from developers to conservationists, probably would like to see like how valid are some of the assumptions for some of these things. I think going forward, because I think the modeling is great, but then I think some of the real benefit too is maybe later down the line of looking at, oh, well, these were the assumptions that were built into the model, but actually, you know, we've worked out this type of mitigation pathway for solar development. So maybe that will be a little bit more relaxed and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to say that I think, and I agree that we'll need to figure out what layers are important to us, but I think that's a good conversation to have. And so I'm glad to hear that it's possible to do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it ties into working in a world of uncertainty that we have evidence of where renewables have been sited up until this point. There are siting and permitting processes out there that in Oregon that are filtering particular types of land use already. So developers are not pursuing projects in particular areas. So that's a starting place. But then as we've talked about, it could go two ways. One is, as you were describing, there are ways of mitigating the impact of land use that we don't currently have, which would be going towards more permissive siting and permitting. But there's the converse of that as well, that as more renewables are located in the state, then there could be greater opposition to further renewable development. And so it is a set of uncertain outcomes going forward from here. And I would say that there's two ways that could be dealt with in the state planning. One is that if we did look at a what if scenario where we were more restrictive, then it is the what if we can't get renewables located at the rate that we would see them in the reference scenario. So it gives us 2 points of comparison that, while not exactly representing the way things play out, we would have one that moved faster and one that moved slower on the renewables, and that would give us some broad conclusions about what else do we have to do in the economy to meet our emissions goals under those two futures. So that's the first way. And then the second way is, as you're describing, there's things that we would learn in the future, and there's things that would change over time that we'd get more information about. And so in future iterations of planning, then you would be using more up-to-date data that's reflective of the evidence from the past years of work. And so thinking about a state energy strategy, it's not just the strategy today that is now the blueprint that will be exactly followed through 2050. It's the first step in a process of evaluating what the next step should be, recognizing that there'll be steps down the road as well as we learn more.
And I do want to emphasize that the way that these levels are described here doesn't necessarily mean that something cannot happen. It's not that like development can never happen in some of these places. I think that we're just trying to get the reference case to a place of what it was like the reasonable assumptions right now in terms of where we're seeing, like, I think some of the other things that Jeremy was talking about is we're looking to a forecast that the Power Council did on what is reasonably likely and combining that with other sort of, so similarly in like the land use and natural resources space, I think we're looking to all of you to help us figure out what is the sort of reasonable assumptions around the reference case. And then what would you want to test out in the what ifs thinking about if some of these changed or not. So Andrew, thanks for asking that question. I know that we have like 4 more slides, but I want to get to John's question 2 in the chat. In consideration of biomass supply, how is availability balanced with the threat of fire and functional retrieval? Addressing the delta between what is present, what is realizable, and the realistic based on past retrieval and utilization. Not 100% sure what retrieval and utilization means, but I think it has to do with forests, maybe. So, Jeremy, if you want to take a crack at it, we could also see if John wants to expand.
Sure. So the biomass supply is from the updated billion-ton study, which there's been it's not the universally well received study. I think there are things that if we were to do a detailed Oregon specific study that we would update from the billion-ton study. And so if there are resources that we should be drawing upon to do that, then we would be very interested in those. I think that particularly as you're describing, cellulosic waste biomass from forestry is one area that in Oregon we could have a more refined assumption if there were a study out there that detailed that and built in the risk of wildfire over time. But I don't know what to rely on in terms of data sources for that. So if you have suggestions, we'd be really open to hearing them and incorporating them.
Yeah, no, there's certainly some additional inputs there. And really also the question was relating to the dynamic difference that is often present between supply assessment across a broad resource, but then the functional there's also a functional component of utilization that there's usually a delta there, right? So the potential is substantive relative to the actuality. And I'm just curious if there's any consideration in that component of the modeling to account for what is the potential delta there, or is it just supply explicit?
Yeah, it's the supply, but it's differentiated by cost. So that's one way that would be built in there, that you get some low-hanging fruit, but then you're walking up the cost curve as you're using more of it. And so in the Northwest, there's some biomass utilization, and particularly where you need a local biomass source, then for things like a carbon stream, then there's some of that, but for large scale biofuel production, then we are typically seeing that produced somewhere else and then imported into the state, just because looking at cost curves, it doesn't make as much sense as to be producing that in the Midwest or something where there's a lot more opportunity.
Great, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands or questions in the chat. We have a few more slides, but I had kind of a, I don't want to say closing because I don't want to close it, but for Jeremy, sort of in terms of this group, in terms of some of the helpful feedback we're hearing, is it the case that this slide where it has sort of the examples and maybe the other ones too that have the links of where the data is from, are we looking for feedback from this group on which data sources and then also which ones to exclude in the reference? Is that fair to summarize?
Yeah, so I would summarize this as an example of a set of screening scenarios that come from PowerPlace West. So there's 3 different levels of screening here. And we have the opportunity in Oregon to be using the ERISA tool, which has Oregon specific layering. And so what I would love for production of the reference case in Oregon and potential other scenarios is a table like this, but identifying the layers in the ERISA tool that constitute the reference scenario and then constitute potentially other scenarios. So that's where I would like to end up for doing the modeling work. But I don't know exactly which of those screening layers are the right ones for us to be using to characterize a realistic path forward for the reference case and then a more restrictive path. So the input from the set of experts here would be really valuable.
Awesome. And we do have a second working group meeting, so we might hear different things from you all. And I think that that would be a good place to sort of compare what we've heard as well. Oh, I see a raised hand. Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I was just wondering, could you show us, I mean, based on the Power of Place in the West screens, I mean, can you focus in on Oregon with what you've already done? And does that get us somewhere as a starting point, or is the granularity is it not refined enough for what we're trying to do now? Or I'm just wondering about how that helps us possibly.
Yeah, so that is a step that I could take where I take the ERISA tool and then basically use the same priorities as TNC had in putting together Power of Place West, so that we have the ERISA tool populated with the same kind of screening layers. There are going to be some differences there because Oregon has some Oregon specific data sources, and these were typically national data sources that were used here. But that would give us a starting point where that might be helpful for this group to react to say that these are the ERISA layers that give us a kind of a TNC priorities set of screening scenarios. What would we change about that for a reference case here? Does that sound like a helpful step to take?
I'm like just kind of scrolling through. So if you're nodding, I'm noting that. But if you have other thoughts, you can put them in the chat too. I'll just say, Amy, in the ERISA tool, there is transmission and substations, but I don't know if it gets to the level of the grid that you want. But Anne, is your hand still up from before? Or did you have another thought there?
No, sorry, it was still up.
Okay, that's okay.
In Zoom, you press it again to lower it, and here you don't. Sorry.
No worries. Okay, well, I know we have 10 more minutes in this meeting, so I'm going to move us through just to, we'll recap a little bit, some thoughts that would be helpful to have between our working group meetings. But I think that we're on, let's see, slide 29 on carbon management to cover a few more here.
Yeah, and Mike, I saw you raised your hand. Did you have a quick point to build off that?
I was just going to add, and there's a number of folks in this group here who are also on the DLCD rack. So good to see everybody there. But, one of the things I think for folks who are looking at energy development in Oregon, they are using ERISA, at least as an initial filter or look there. So I think it's a valuable source of information. So to Jeremy's question there about the inclusion of that, I think having that on there is going to be important. I haven't looked specifically about how that lines up to Power of Place in that data source and how much overlap there is there, but I think it's something to consider.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. So we are getting, as Ruchi pointed out, we only have a couple more minutes, and we certainly want to end on time. I know you're all busy people. I do want to highlight, as far as carbon management, we've already spoken to kind of the emission reduction target is the goal for the energy strategy. So I don't want to touch on that. We talked about clean fuels. I do want to mention around carbon capture and storage or sequestration, that for the reference case, we are not going to incorporate that within the reference case. That could be a what if there's down the road, if we want to have a higher emissions goal or something like that, we need to incorporate that. But we are not planning to use that as a resource in the reference case of the model. We acknowledge like the potential value of land sinks and natural working lands in decarbonization, but we just didn't think this was the project for it. And we're focused on the emissions from the energy sector. We also want to acknowledge that the Oregon Climate Action Committee is doing a lot of work around inventorying the carbon sequestered and stored on natural working lands. And we don't want to get ahead of those conversations, but certainly, as Ruchi pointed out, this is an iterative process. So that might be something that's maybe incorporated down the road for the energy strategy. And we touched on some of our previous discussion points around ERISA, but another thing that Jeremy brought up was kind of a question around vehicle miles traveled. And I hate to throw this out because it's a great question. And if we don't have a ton of time now, we can certainly bring this back in the next meeting. But I wanted to bring this to your attention. You know, the Oregon Transportation Plan has an existing target of a 20% vehicle miles traveled reduction for passenger vehicles by 2050. And that would go a long way to making some of those changes around spatial planning. And so wanted to see how realistic or what this group thought of that target and whether it should be incorporated within the reference scenario.
I'll just add something from a person who works in rural communities a lot, trying to develop projects and trying to make sure people are happy. I hear a lot of fear around reduction of people being able to, any policy or any conversation about reducing vehicle use and the type of vehicles that specifically farmers and ranchers have. There's a lot of fear and pushback. So just want to note that I think it's a very hot, fearful topic for people, and just wanted to make a note of that.
Yeah, it is. And within the ODOT's transportation plan, they do acknowledge, I think the goal would be a greater focus of that reduction in vehicle miles traveled in the metropolitan areas of the state and less so in rural areas. And so the relationship of that is important to note. Thanks for bringing that up. Andrew, did you have a question or a thought?
Yeah, just to answer your question about do I think that, or do folks think that the VMT reduction proposal by ODOT is something we should use? I don't know off the top of my head from 1000 Friends of Oregon's perspective, but I have folks that I can ask on staff, so I'll do that and try and get back to you.
That'd be wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And I guess that goes for, we don't need answers directly today, so much as we want to pose these questions and have you think about them and certainly either submit comments in the public portal or send us a note, or we can talk about it in the next meeting as well. Well, so we also have a discussion. We're going to talk about kind of the potential outputs of the modeling that might be interesting. I think with only 5 minutes left, I don't want to dive into that at this point, but we'll table that to our next meeting, as well as we've talked a lot about the what if scenario building. We've got some examples here. I would like to bring back this conversation. I know Jeremy's spoken to this and kind of the importance of looking at how we could look at the model, how we could make some what if questions, to kind of adjust those levers and how would we want to compare against the reference scenario. So we've just got a couple of examples. I'm sure other people can think of different what if scenarios they're interested in learning more about. So maybe if you could think about that between now and the next meeting, and I'd love to hear your feedback and hear some of your ideas of what you'd like to see, or if not the what if scenario, then what are the kind of the end results or things you'd like to learn from the energy strategy around land use and natural resources. So we didn't have time for a public comment because we had lots of great kind of discussion within this meeting. I would like to try to make some time for that in our next meeting, and so signal to public members that aren't part of the working group. We will try to make some time for a working group for a public comment session where we can have people join us and add some additional thoughts or questions.
I do want to just also say that, Michael, there was one question in the chat from Natalia.
Okay.
I think Amy might be willing to jump in and clarify. I think it was kind of related to the point you were making earlier about the carbon sinks. Amy, are you still there?
Is that directed at me? Oh, the other Amy. Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, sorry, just having some technical difficulties at WebEx that started right when you asked me to talk. Yes, so I'm responding to the question from Natalia. Natalia, you asked, does it mean that the forestry sector will not be considered in greenhouse gas calculations and policy planning? And the answer is yes, with an asterisk. So we are not going to be including emissions from forest activities, meaning the cutting down of trees, nor sinks related, greenhouse gas sinks related to forestry in the model. And the reason for this is because Oregon's sector-based greenhouse gas emissions inventory excludes biological emissions. So sources of carbon from the removal of biological materials or the burning of biological materials. So our greenhouse gas reduction goals also exclude these types of emissions. And so the model itself is not going to be including emissions from biological sources. But there are potentially opportunities to consider sinks, so sequestration of carbon in biological plant matter through other scenarios, but they won't be included in the reference scenario.
Thanks, Amy. Sorry, Michael, I interrupted you if you want to do the rest of the wrap up.
Oh, no, Richie, I think this is great. And I know you were kind of wondering about the best way for people to communicate. I got a question about the best way to kind of communicate or provide feedback, maybe between now and the next meeting. I'll follow up and you can certainly send me an email. I'm welcome to get those. And if I get those emails, it can help me kind of shape the agenda for the next meeting and find out what you're interested in or what questions you have about. The public comment portal is also a good avenue to do that. We'll be cataloging everything we hear from people. So if you send something to me, I would also catalog it in that place as well. We want to keep track of everything as best we can. But ultimately, as far as wrap up, I just want to highlight that we have another meeting next week on the 12th. And so please attend that. And then there'll be a final meeting where we get everybody together, similar to the first working group meeting, get everybody together, kind of present on what we've heard and talk it through. So I certainly appreciate everybody making the time to attend this meeting. Here's the public comment portal, and I can certainly send that in an email. We'll post the PowerPoint slides and the 2-pager that I shared earlier today. And if there's other resources or the questions you have, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Happy to help. But I really appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you next time. Have a nice lunch if you're going to lunch now.
Thanks,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.